understand. Thank you for the offer. Is anyone started? I'm good, thank you.
No, but if you ever call for a pizza right before the end of the meeting, on your future date, I think you should ask.
Yeah, I was definitely get pizza.
We were so jealous of you that way.
I thought that I asked people if they wanted it.
No, but I was like, that was just a rock star moment. I've never.
That was awesome.
It was so slick. It was pizza. Money, okay. You kept going.
I was like, gosh, I can't believe this is the first time I've done this.
I know.
Yeah, and you like won the meeting.
Yeah, it was epic.
But then it adjourned right after that.
It did.
Yeah.
And I was definitely like, oh my God. Okay, so anyway, all right, I'm almost in here. So the first thing on our agenda is the item around special events policy. And, I'll call the meeting to order at 6:08. Yeah. And repealing ordinance 3004, repealing and replacing chapter 462 street festivals of the Shorewood Municipal Code, otherwise referred to as the special events policy, meeting 6. So we've been through this a bunch of times, and then some additional questions came up, and so we're just revisiting those one last time. Well, it could be not the last time, but we're revisiting it. And so that and I'm gonna pull up the, I had a conversation with Sarah, so she walked me through all those. Trustee Warren, did you have a chance to review the questions?
I did.
And sorry, I'm trying to open my packet. So one of the questions on there was, do we want to consider limiting the street closures? And I recall, I don't know if you were on the board, on this committee at that time, but originally that was one of the items that we needed to, that staff asked for direction on in the policy, as to whether the policy would limit the number of street closures related to special events throughout the year. And the committee at that time unanimously decided not to. I think you came on after that.
I think it came up once or twice, and I agree with that direction. And
Okay.
I don't think we should. I mean, I think we can make it discretionary, and I think we can use our discretion to determine whether there are too many in a given year. But I don't think we need to attach a number to the number of street closures that we have at this point.
Okay. So welcome, Trustee Walker. Hello. We just got started with the special.
Okay.
All right. So I have a new, I apologize that I was not open and ready here. I have a new computer and it doesn't let me download things very easily. So, let's stand, Trustee Bockhorst was on the committee that, when it was in the formation of unanimously agreeing not to limit street closures. So we'll just resolve that question. So we would go forward with a policy that does not recommend and limiting the number of street closures in the year. Right. So the other quick correction, if you wouldn't mind, since I'm struggling to open my packet.
So there was a couple items brought up from other village board members, just to make sure that we had touch base, and then a few from staff. So the first one, prioritization of events and road closures should be given first to the village and affiliated committees, second to the bid in schools, and last to private businesses. Was one thing to consider.
I'm sorry, Pamela. Would you be able to tell us which were recommended by staff and which were?
Yep, this was village board. or trustee. Um, So that was a suggestion, which does kind of tie in with the next one. Any organization should be given a deadline annually to submit events, particularly road closures, so the village board has an overview of the time and resources required of the village. Suggested date, March 1st. The board would have an opportunity to review an annual schedule, which I do believe was talked about already at one point, just to kind of know that we didn't have the situation where the feast was going on and the Packer party in the same weekend, that we had pre-planned that.
I'm okay with making a suggestion, but let's make it discretionary, you know.
Right.
I think we can say, like, we'd like to see it so we have an opportunity to plan and resource it, but I also don't want to foreclose, if a good opportunity
Yep.
comes along, a great event is planned, I don't want to foreclose it because it comes in on March 3rd as opposed to March
Right.
1st.
And I definitely don't know if some of it ties in that it would be written such as in the ordinance, but more that, so that the discussion had been had.
Right, so basically, we're reviewing a list of questions that came in with regards, asking that.
These are suggestions as well, though.
These are suggestions. And so we are, some of these we've already talked about months ago, but just for the purpose of having the conversation, just to make sure we're all clear. That's kind of what the purpose of this is. So yes, trustee
No, I
Bonner.
understand that. I also don't necessarily think that we're all in agreement that the conclusion of the suggestions is, unanimously supported.
Yep.
So I personally don't have a problem with applications coming in and the village staff being able to make decisions. I don't think, and I know this applies to not only this, but to other things that have come up in discussion, especially in the last budget, about everything needing to come in on an annual basis. That's just not life. And that's, in fact, in my tenure on the board and even prior to that, the amount of festivals and opportunities that exist in this community have almost always come up, within 3 months or so of the event. I'm not including the major bid events or anything that takes mass production. So although in a perfect world we would have copious amounts of time to review and to plan and budget, it's just not the reality of the situation, and I would really hate to stifle the artistic and the community creation that is involved in this stuff just because the board, yes, I'd love to have ample of time. And I also don't see a problem with some of the things such as the street closure or there being a feast and a Packer party. I think that's great. I'm for more than having fewer. So I don't think I would have decided, I would not have decided any other way.
Yep.
So please continue, but, so you're still going through the trustee?
Yep, I'm still going through,
Could you go through the staff ones first? Is that possible? Because
Sure.
maybe a lot of the trustee things will be addressed.
sure. Did you have something to add to that real quick?
Oh, no, I was thinking more of a recommendation. Again, you don't want to foreclose. I agree with a lot of the points made by trustee Rockhurst. You don't want to foreclose events, and frankly, life is life. You're not going to get 9 months notice on everything.
Right.
It'd be nice for staff to be able to plan to get it as early as possible, but I don't want to miss out on a great event because we have a deadline sitting there, so.
Right.
Or a deadline, and frankly, if it gets too close to the event, then we can say we can't do this event this year, we'll do it this year.
Right, and then, trying to put some of that around is more so that people can submit, so we have time to bring it to you guys and not be able to tell them, oh, now there's no board meeting before your event.
We talked that through,
Yeah.
and that's already in the policy,
Yeah.
so.
And part of this, isn't this just so that you don't have to bring everything to us as well, so that staff can have the direction and decision-making power that's necessary to not have to bring every single event to the board?
So, one of the conversations that came up in the last couple weeks was events at Atwater Park. And do those really require a special event permit because we aren't regulating things at the park? We don't close the park down for events. We tell people who's ever having something there that it's still open to the public. So what had happened was there was a Jewish farmers market that had come to request for selling at the park, and then also St. Robert's had come in to do a mass at the park. And then we're like, well, are those special events, are they not? Somebody doing yoga on a Saturday morning with a bunch of people, is that a special event, is it not? And we don't really, require from our other parks to post special events. So discussion among staff was more, should the special event permit just strictly be for street closures? And any additional permits, such as like a temporary Class B, short-term cabaret cabaret license, things like that, that you would need to pull to have something at the park, those would apply to those people. So like, Men's Chicken Barbecue, they would need short-term cabaret or temporary class B, and they would go on their day. But because we would, we said we could really be getting into like the permit business of like everybody needing it, and you're inundated with approving special events for somebody doing Tai Chi with 30 people, or the middle school band playing. Is that a special event? That was part of our concern after thinking some of that through.
And I would like to get to the point where we have to approve less, and that if there's a problem, that we have a superfluous amount of events or usage of our public spaces, and we deal with that, instead of trying to get ahead of every possible situation.
Yep.
So I appreciate that you guys are trying to make that distinction.
I agree.
And also one other thing, I will say the discussions, in my opinion, that we generally have at the board level are generally in anticipation of events and all the things that could run. We rarely have a discussion, I don't even remember one, after the fact of any event, saying how terrible it was and we should not allow that in X, Y, or Z. I mean, of course, that's anecdotal evidence that would prove that it's going to continue that way, but.
Yep, so part of the discussion to offshoot that was the fee structure. So instead of doing like a flat permit fee for the special event, would it be a little more advantageous to say, I'm just throwing numbers up there, so I don't know the exact cost, but it's $250 to close the road, plus additional potential public works overtime and police if needed, and these are your charges as such. Or it's $15 to turn on the electricity at Atwater Park because St. Robert's is having their mass and they need a loudspeaker. Those type of things where it's costing that additional staff time, but it's not this one branch fee over permit.
I can see the argument there. I just don't want to make this too complicated and end up, by the time we're figuring out which fees we need to assess, we're taking more staff time than those fees were. Like that would be my worry if we're saying, like, it's $10 to turn like $5 to this, all of a sudden, you're going back and forth for 3 hours to collect $20 in fees. So I just want to make sure, and from the other side, we also don't want to make it too complicated for our residents who are applying for these fees. I mean, I'm okay with it, and that makes sense from a logistical standpoint, but I also do want to make sure that we do something to get them in this.
So part of why that came up was, so Lakefront Marathon comes in, they require nothing from us. They pay $150 to run on the side of the road. We don't even know they're here. So that was it then, or should we really be charging a special event if they really don't require village services? So as we were diving in, it got a little more complex.
I think these are great questions. So is there a staff recommendation, or other than as far as a fee schedule, no fee schedule,
So if there was a fee schedule, we would put a fee schedule together. Either staff that was really impacted by the fees had no yes or no answer on it. They were fine with whatever was decided.
So to me, it sounds like the absence of a fee schedule for the time being is the simplest, and if staff's not asking for it, then I'm not sure why we're, but
I believe the policy says that, the ordinance says that fees that are incurred as a
Correct.
result of each event would be assessed,
Oh, so if you have a catch-all, I mean, then
Yeah, we do have a catch-all.
then you can do it in an event. You can already do what you're proposing to do,
Yeah.
so.
So I think we can end it.
I've run the lakefront twice, so thank you for not charging them. They operate on the.
Well, we have. Well, it's one of those things, like if they don't need technically village services,
Yeah.
Well,
is it a
I signed
special
up for
event?
it once.
that
was my
You paid the fee, the village fee, basically.
I did not run it, but I signed up for it.
Yeah, so that was part of the discussion then of like, well, is it really needed if village services aren't?
I think, my recollection of the intent behind the ordinance, the draft that's before us, is that it was a policy around street closures So if an event requires a street closure, this is kind of how it
Okay.
goes.
Yep.
So I think that anything that requires a street closure and is requesting for that, gets charged, gets that permit,
Yep.
applies for the permit, is reviewed and charged at that amount. Any event that occurs in a park that does not require a street closure or on private property is not a special event, and, we already discussed that in the, just to
Yep.
confirm what we did before.
Can I add to that, just that if it doesn't require village staff time, it shouldn't require a fee
Right. That was kind of,
or a permit or an application.
yeah.
I don't know, because
I think we would still want them to fill out the application, so ideally that's kind of what,
Well, there could be an application.
but no fees.
Or an application fee that's administrative, like $25, whatever you
Yeah.
think is commensurate with your time.
So I think ideally we
Or
just
not.
want to know the presence, right? Like we, with like St. Robert's.
I let
Dancers,
staff
which is
use their
farmers market,
discretion to put a
Okay.
fee on there,
Um,
but
you know.
that's me, just me.
We were fine with them filling out the paper, that we knew that an event was going on, but it wasn't an event in our eyes and some of that stuff. But then we were like, oh, what about like the Lakefront Marathon, or like when they run the Ragnar through here? Like, some people don't even know what's happening, right? So,
Yeah, sorry. No, I agree, like, you guys should, I have no idea how much time it requires, like, you guys are the ones to put together any kind of fee that's required. So,
And then it would be up to us to like say that's too high, too low, or what are we gonna do? Maybe we need to fund some of this or not.
how did we choose the $150?
that was here before. Like,
It's 100, and I'm trying to think if that was, when they created the special event permit, is probably when they came up with the fee. And it was just probably just based on what they thought staff time was, because even though it may not affect each department had to review it.
Yeah, that's
So
why I would
review
say
time.
with the fee for, even if services aren't, there's a review process where everybody has to.
Well, I meant any administrative, yeah, that's what I meant by it.
Yeah, so
If
I'm-
staff has to touch it or approve it
Yeah.
or do that, makes sense.
So I think $100, whatever it is now, I would keep it at that, and then if it requires additional services on top of that from DPW or public safety, then those are assessed.
Okay, yeah, the big thing was that we really wanted to kind of talk to the Atwater, especially Atwater Park, I know the other parks have things going on. But if you're like, oh, what really constitutes a special event there, when we don't really want to.
If government doesn't have to get involved,
Right.
it's not government's
Right.
job to get involved.
Well, and we don't have the staff time for 2 or 3 permits a week to come through and analyze
And it's a
them.
value
Yeah.
to the community, it doesn't increase public safety, it doesn't increase access, it doesn't.
If anything, it almost limits because we have these open spaces and, that you want to encourage people to use them and also get out of their way when they're using the public space, when the public's using the public spaces, if they're not doing anything that hurts them about private. So I don't
Any
want to
other-
be two-bedroom community and
Mhm.
regulate which types of events that we as a board think are suitable to the visitors or inhabitants of the village.
So we concur that there's no need to prioritize events or, to add any prioritization in the language in the ordinance. We don't want to regulate events in the park, and we don't want to limit the number of street closures that we have per year. Does that round out?
Yep, and then there was just one more from a village board member to suggest different level of review for private events, which I believe was discussed at one time to charge different fees for nonprofit and for profit. I think we
We said
decided no,
fee
no,
is-
correct?
Fee is across the board flat, but service fees.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we can still assess under the ordinance. I think,
Yeah.
I remember having that
We
discussion.
had that
We were
discussion.
pretty in-depth,
Yeah.
and it just got too complex, who got charged, what fee, and
Yeah.
all of a
It
sudden,
was here for part of
you're
that,
making,
yeah,
you're making choices that maybe you don't see something
right.
on the front end, and then all of a sudden you have to,
Yep.
so the most consistent, easiest way is to implement it across the board.
But then we have added the caveat that it would be board's discretion to waive certain fees based on community events.
And then the one last question, just to cover real quick.
Brings it back to us.
If a request comes in for a multiple day event, would each day require a separate permit and a separate fee?
I don't think so. I mean, I think you want to make it easier to have these events, and I think it gets kind of it gets much more complicated if you have to apply for separate things. I'd say you just do one permit fee.
This was a staff question?
That was staff question.
Yeah, so I don't know what the protocol is on that, if there is a recommendation, or if staff has a recommendation on that. So, I mean, I don't see it as a separate event, it's one,
Right, it would be,
but
I
I
guess
don't
it
know.
would come to us. So say somebody wanted to do a 3-day street closure. It's a sleepover. Let's say it's a camp out. It's an elementary.
Right, Oakland Avenue?
Yeah, it's a team building exercise and it's fifth graders from all across the North Shore and we're all gonna camp out on Oakland for 3 nights. So let's say that that's the concept. We review it as a board and we say, yeah, have at it, or no, you can have one night, or no, or wouldn't we, that would be the process, right? I don't wanna limit people's creativity, we don't
Right.
have to approve everything. but-
And I really don't think they'll be designed by a board committee or board to like determine which, again, are acceptable.
Yep.
Maybe we could do that with the decoration policy.
So are we saying just one fee, one?
So pretty much everything is the same except for that we are gonna require Atwater, any events at Atwater Park or the parks to pull a special event permit fee. So,
Only if it's, the street closure.
only the street closure, correct?
Yeah.
Yes.
So if park-based events
Yeah.
would only pull the permits that relate to those events.
Yeah, okay.
Does that make sense?
Yep,
Yeah,
that's,
okay. That's what we said, right?
Within this, like, I mean, this is specific to street festivals, so.
Yeah.
We just,
okay.
that's the scope.
Oh, well then let's,
And well, and some of it hasn't been
Yeah.
past practice, so that's why I wanted to,
Ah.
if Serve Atwater was a special event where it really wouldn't constitute as a special event, then it would constitute with a short-term cabaret license. Because it's in on the beach.
Then that's easier, yeah. I
Yeah.
think at the time it was
Yeah.
only, it.
Correct, because then we got into the like, what, why would they qualify but not St. Robert's, or why would, like,
Yeah,
why, so,
I think my recollection is the
Yeah.
only reason why they were told, they described the event and they were told by the,
yeah,
the staff at the time that that was.
which,
would
it made
qualify.
sense at the time.
Exactly, but now we are, got it,
Yeah.
got it.
So that,
As
that
long as those types of people still, those groups would be able to still host an event, like there's there's a permit for everyone.
correct, yeah. They would still be pulling some sort of permit. so-
Yes, exactly. Okay,
Okay, thank you.
so we can resolve that. Thank you very much for that care and concern.
is that right?
Yeah, on that one.
Item 2, consider ordinance 3006 to update chapter 275 electrical standards of the village code to correspond with the Wisconsin Department of Safety and Professional Services chapter SPS 316. So this item is coming to us, it's kind of what I call a housekeeping item. I will turn it over to Planning Director Bart to give an overview.
Thank you. I completely agree. It's housekeeping. It's how we administer the code currently anyways, but the state had an opportunity to review our electrical code based on new requirements of being registered. And they came back with a few things that they asked us to clean up in the code. So the one thing, it's the 4 bullet points in the memo. It would clarify that only owner occupants of single-family dwellings may perform electrical work and minor repairs in the dwelling in which they reside. Our current code also states that owner occupants of 2-family dwellings may do so, and that's outdated and not accurate, and we don't allow that to happen, so this would just clarify current practice. It would also exempt manufacturing and industrial facilities from obtaining permits for electrical work, as allowed per state statutes. We don't really have a lot of that happening anyways, so it's not really changing much, if anything. It would revise emergency permit exceptions that currently allow 2 days to obtain a permit to align with the state code that requires permits be obtained no later than the next business day. And it also removes gendered language from the code. Several places it references gendered language that wasn't necessary. So this is an ordinance. We bring it to committee first just for recommendation and discussion. It's largely housekeeping, as I mentioned. The action required, I think I have a move to approve and be a move to recommend approval of. And then just another error of mine that I want to point out. Attachment number 2 is ordinance 3006, not ordinance 2099. But other than that, it is largely housekeeping, just to align with the state requirements of being a registered electrical inspection agency.
Thank you. I just realized we did not take action. We were supposed to consider the policy, the previous item. consider this as well. So I'll come back to that procedurally. But thank you for that explanation.
Could we take both of these at the same time?
No, because they're roll call votes, is there
Okay.
ordinances, I think?
Roll call with any minute?
Oh, no, well,
No,
we
not
don't
committee.
take roll call here.
Uh-uh.
Okay, we would just make a motion to take it to full board.
Yep.
So, mental note, we'll come back to item number 1 somehow. Questions for Director Bard? Or would you like to make a motion?
I move to approve, sorry, do you have any questions? I'm still going to move to approve ordinance 3006 to update chapter 275 electrical standards of the village code to correspond with the Wisconsin Department of Safety and Professional Services chapter SPS 3.
I'll second that.
Okay, any discussion?
Just a quick, just out of curiosity, why did they, I think you might have covered this, but I missed it. Why did they remove two-family, owner of two families?
I don't know the answer to that. I think it's been removed a long time ago, and our code just never got updated when they removed it, so I'd have to
Okay.
ask for history on that. I can send it to you separately, but I don't
If
know.
it's easy,
Yeah.
I'm just curious. It's
Yeah.
not, this is not an important, highly important. But if it's always it matches the.
Yes. Yep.
All right, I'm good.
Okay, so all those in favor of the motion on the floor? Against? Motion carries. So that'll go to full board.
You want to go back to the other one?
Yeah, let's go back to item number 1. I'm going to reopen that agenda item. Do I have a motion to move this policy to full board as it's written? As presented, I should say.
So moved.
I'll second.
Okay, all those in favor, or any discussion? Anybody in the public want to speak? One person. Okay. All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Against?
Perfect, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, item 3, consider a zip car pilot program for stations in public parking lots. So this is a very interesting item, because it makes it sound like we're canceling a pilot program.
Right.
But really, Zipcar just is kind of not around anymore, and we don't know why. So it's a very interesting, I know it was in our packet as far as Director Bart finalizing, or, summarizing the context for this, but I'll hand it over just for a little.
Yeah, so just within the scope of the transportation and parking analysis, there was a comment that we should have more Zipcar locations, at which point we responded that ones that are in the village are actually not being utilized. So we reached out to Zipcar to try to confirm whether or not this was intentional or whatnot. Zipcar is not responding to anyone about anything. I've been on hold for 2 hours with them. I've emailed them, it bounces back with frequently asked questions, you should look at this first. So we're just having an impossible time getting a hold of them. But from our perspective, they have not been utilized in probably over 2 years. And so, in looking at the history of it, there was an intention to bring it back after 1 year. There was a pilot order for 1 year with an intention to bring it back to determine whether or not we should be charging them for our spaces or continue as is. So just kind of to close the loop on the conversation of this, it was intended to come back. I have no record of it coming back, so I'm not sure what happened there. We can't get a hold of them. They have 2 spaces that are currently occupying public parking spaces that could be used by the public throughout the day. So just in context of those conversations, the transportation and parking analysis, we could keep them signed there forever and then we just couldn't use them, or I could try, for one more attempt to get back to Zipcar and give them a final notice saying if we don't hear from you in, X days, we take this as a sign that the spaces are not utilized and we'll remove the signs, DPW have to remove the signs, unless you have different direction, but it's kind of housekeeping on this end too, just to see what happened here.
Trustee Warren?
But you've already called, you've already emailed.
Yes.
There's something to be said for, I don't know how many one more chances you want to give. Is Zipcar still, are they still operational in Milwaukee?
They are in Milwaukee still. I don't think they have anything at UWM anymore either. Diane, correct me if I'm wrong, but I know they're still downtown.
There was one off of Kenwood at one time. I'm not sure if it's still there anymore, but people Uber now,
I was gonna say, yeah, it's an Uber, Lyft, scooter,
Yeah.
bike phenomenon. I think that at one point, I was a member of Zipcar, for disclosure, I was a member of Zipcar, when they first came out as well. I no longer find the need for that either, so I think they're retracting to places where they're most useful and perhaps our locations are not utilized, so.
Well, and what I found interesting is that, again, it's kind of a housekeeping issue. I I don't, and that we could, if Zipcar, you know, if somebody came to us and there was a reason to re-engage the pilot program or a full program, we could do that. So it doesn't, any action we take now doesn't impact the future. I would support removing the signage just because there isn't any, it doesn't seem like there's a market need and the company isn't responding.
Yeah, same thing, I would just make sure that whatever agreement that we had, if we have a copy of it, that by us removing the sign, we're not violating,
Yeah, I found no record of an agreement. That's,
I know.
We're behind it.
we found no record of an agreement, it seemed more of a conversation thing.
Yeah.
So, but I'll look one more time, I suppose, but I'm not finding it.
And I just, you know, I know that you put this in the packet, but just for the record, yeah, I looked online for Zipcar locations, they don't even have locations marked in Shorewood, so.
Yeah, correct.
They seem to have already moved past.
They've moved on.
Yes.
They moved to Whitefish Bay.
They're nowhere up the North Shore, they're just all kind of clustered downtown.
Yeah, they're
East side
mostly
downtown.
Well, I will comment because this was something that I brought to the village
I know, you were a big
back in the day, and I'm glad that we had it, and it's unfortunate, but maybe it's a sign of other shared ride. Hopefully this is a positive sign versus.
Different disruptors have disrupted the
Yeah,
cars model,
yeah.
so
This purpose.
potentially.
Yeah, 5 years is a long time for all.
Right, and when we did discuss having a pilot, I think it was more of the same thing, like some people were like, why should we allow a private business to have this, and we said, well, we'll see what, you know, the usership and all that is, and then like everything else, a million other things require the priority of probably staff time, so. Interesting though, 2 years, huh?
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I've been here 2 years, I've never seen them utilized, so that's just my
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I believe it, because
estimate of that.
yeah.
So, is there a motion to remove the signage and move on, or, well, I don't want to tell you what the motion is. Would anyone like to
Well,
make a motion?
I would like to, can I make one other comment first? And I know this is a topic for a different discussion, but I imagine your staff, I imagine you're going to release those spots or allow them. I know that there's been discussion of charging stations for electric cars and whatnot. I don't know what the requirements are, how much space and whatnot that you need for that, but we might want to allow staff to have discretion to, or, you know, because it's where we may as well encourage sustainable transportation options. And those spots haven't been generating revenue for countless years now. Anyway, it's just a thought, and I don't know if it's appropriate to discuss that at this time, but that's, I would say that I would, and with the traffic and circulation study coming on, I don't feel that the 50 or 70 or how much dollars a month is going to make or break us, but I don't know either, like how easy it is.
It wasn't one of those, it's not a night spot, it's just a daytime. It's
Oh,
just
okay.
like a front lot.
Gotcha.
Yeah, so
Okay.
it never generated.
And then just lastly, just as a PR standpoint, and I know that you've done your due diligence on this, obviously, I don't even know sure listed here, but we might want to add something in the manager's bulletin that, you know, Zipcar has not been present in Shorewood for numerous years, so we're opening up the spot to the public instead of reserving it for a private entity that's not, say it nicer than this, but, you know, playing with us.
Unless we want to do the electric. I mean, maybe you need overnight, but I don't know electric cars going up.
All right.
We need that to be an overnight, so.
Well, yeah, I think they said that. Well, the one on the north end was an overnight spot though, right? There was one up by,
44-minute block.
Yep.
yeah.
And that one's been removed for some years now.
Oh, that's right,
That
that's
was
what I
the-
remember, they came and someone took the sign
Yeah.
away maybe, or
Yep.
someone who wants a souvenir, but yeah, just I would say that we would let people know that we are not kicking Zipcar out of the community, that they haven't been here, and that we're looking for exploring opportunities such as either electric or just additional public parking. Yeah,
I think that,
so
that's,
maybe we could put that in the manager's bulletin, I don't know that we need to make a motion on it, but Rebecca,
well, then I can make a motion.
Okay.
I will move to recommend ending the Zipcar pilot program for stations in public parking lots.
Second. We'll have a moment of silence.
okay, I'm over it.
Any discussion?
Proud that we brought this to shore.
I do too, thank you. And yeah, I'll take a moment to say thank you, trustee Blackhurst, for bringing it to Shorewood. You did
Transportation options change so quickly.
They
nowadays.
do.
smart.
Maybe this could be a scooter parking space.
All those in favor? Aye. Passes. Okay, we have one more item. Item number 4, consider next steps of potential short-term rental regulations, also AKA Airbnb.
Although there are multiple other places.
That's true, right. The most recognized brand,
It's like Kleenex.
it's like Kleenex or Band-Aid, right? Okay, so,
So once again, I found out I was rushed my memo, so on April 1st, 2019, not 2018, so it was the spring. It was, based on the complaint, it was discussed as a future agenda item at the village board level, and was directed down to community business relations for further consideration. There was no priority or timeline given on it, so it kind of hasn't emerged to top of my to-do list, but based on some additional conversations that we're receiving in terms of the DNC next year and people preparing for that, staff thought it might be a good time to bring it back to the community business relations to discuss whether or not there is a desire to look at permitting this activity, understanding what we can and can't do based on the state. So just in terms of timelines and stuff, I wanted to bring it back to this committee before it got too late perhaps to consider acting on anything. I outlined 4 general questions, kind of high level, just to understand where we want to go with this, because I don't want to write an ordinance or a permit process if there's no desire to do so. So the first question that I've outlined in the bullet points is, should the village require a local permit or license to operate a short-term rental? If so, who would review or approve of that application? Next, what level of enforcement or follow-up would be expected? Proactive, periodic, annual, complaint-based? And then the fourth one, are there any minimum standards to consider, whether it's required guest registration, owner occupancy limits, parking requirements, use of outdoor areas, etc. I did briefly look at additional, losing my words here, Madison and Village of Greendale both have regulations on these, so I did look at those. Just to understand where we might go with these things, but I guess my first question is there even an appetite to proceed?
I will open up the discussion among the committee, and I will share my bias that I have no interest in regulating this item, so, but have at it.
Go ahead. All right, well, I share that as well for a variety of reasons. And I will state this though, that a lot of places such as Madison, not necessarily, it was a Greenfield or Greendale, have competing interests with also hotels and other industries, and they also have, and maybe Shorewood will get to this place, and not sure that we're there yet, but where there are companies, organizations, whatnot, purchasing single-family homes and then using them for these types of purposes, driving up rent. Also, I say this while also saying that I don't think we're there and that I don't want to regulate this. But anyway, so there are different factors. One of the reasons that, or a couple of the reasons that I feel right now we shouldn't regulate this, but we should maybe look, monitor this going forward. Number one, I know we've received a couple of complaints, but we don't make broad-based decisions based on just a couple of complaints. Those also haven't necessarily been verified to my knowledge. I don't know if the police have been called or there have been official reports that have been filed. In fact, one of the complainants contacted me and I said, I completely understand that you don't appreciate this activity occurring next door to you, but as a board, we don't make policy based just on, I would want you to go to the police, I would want this documented, to have a trail before we would broad-based, legislate this, because we all know how it goes. You get complaints. We don't have people calling us saying, hey, Shorewood, it's so great that you're not regulating Airbnb. I've stayed at so-and-so Airbnb, but when my in-laws come to town, I'm so happy that there's a place for them to stay because I only have a 2-bedroom flat and, there are no hotels in Shorewood, Whitefish Bay, or within a couple of miles of our great walkable community. So there's that. There's also our Vision 2025 statement. We're an open, welcome community. We want to encourage people to come and visit here. We don't have hotels, as we've said. We want to encourage people to come and, hopefully want to put down roots here in the future or spend money in the business community, whatever the case may be. So there aren't any lodging options. And not everyone is in a fortunate situation to have a 3 or 4 bedroom house where they can, host or want to host guests for that reason, or others from out of town. We also talk a lot at this board about affordability and about how expensive it is to live in Shorewood and how we really want to encourage people, young families, all different demographics to come and live here. But our average house, a median house price is cost prohibitive for a lot of, individuals. And we also, we live in a very maker economy. So the ability for people to generate additional revenue to support their, living in Shorewood, sending their schools here, paying the property taxes, et cetera, I wouldn't want to unnecessarily burden them in those creative opportunities. And let's be frank, we can't, as the law, we cannot regulate it as far as the state, the loophole is anything over 7 days, right? So 7 days, say what you will, but 7 days is still a short-term rental in my opinion. So we're, as a government, are we saying, okay, 2 days is worse than 7 day, and again, if it is a problem, then yes, I think we definitely, do something about it, but it's one of those things, just like the zip cars and in other things, it's kind of like you gotta let things try out or play out. In Airbnb, sorry, I'm a little long-winded about, I know we have time though, but I will, I will try to be succinct here. But I don't know, I was talking to a friend, and again, this is anecdotal, but there are so many different examples of how this friend has a timeshare and is so happy that it's the last year of the timeshare, because she's like, you don't even need timeshares anymore with Airbnb and the ability to, rent places all around the world in really unique spots. And again, I know some people say that this is a residential community, but what a great thing to have a residential community where some outsiders can come and, get a taste of Shorewood that you wouldn't normally. It's not a resort town, and that's the true experience that often travelers, kind of want, is the flavor of the neighborhoods and architecture and hearing the kids down the block. Now, the other things that can happen in any situation where you have, folks coming, yes, you can have people who might not respect some of the local laws, who might be loud, but we also have a system mechanism in the police department that you can call. We have complaint systems. We have ways to already in place to deal with those. So I know I'm about to get off my soapbox, but I can understand again if this were competing with our hotel district, if we were having problems with homes being purchased or businesses or not going on the proper tax bills. I know there's some other state loopholes that are kind of tricky, but we do have the ability at any time as a board to then address those issues if they actually are issues. Thank you. Trustee Ward.
Well, I do think Trustee Backward makes many salient points on this issue, but I do think I'm a little bit in the minority in this room. I would be open to looking at some sort of short-term license based on the cities of Madison and Village of Greendale. I'd kind of like to see what they have in place and see if it fits our community. I just think that given our proximity to the city, we have seen some increased activity in this space, and with DNC 2020 coming, I think it makes sense. I'd like to do licensure would give us tracking, give us further information. So I would certainly be open to taking a look at that. Now again, I think I'm the minority in this room, but where I'm coming from, I think it does make some sense to look at whether it makes, for lack of a better term, makes sense for the community to put in place some sort of regulation around these short-term rentals.
What would that look like, to look at the other ordinances or policies? Yeah, I guess they would be ordinances. And how would you assess whether it makes sense for Shorewood?
I guess I would have to see it. It'd be one of those things where I don't know what their ordinances look like. I don't know if it's you pay $50 and you're licensed for a short-term rental, or that subjects you to a higher degree of scrutiny if there are noise complaints. I don't know specifically what they look like. I think it does make some sense, but I don't have, without seeing the particulars, it's tough for me to formulate kind of a plan on exactly what the ordinance should look like. But we do know that there's a framework on which we could base our own ordinance, and those cities could serve as examples. Again, I do understand and respect Trustee Bachler's points, but for me, it would be something where I'd be open to take a look
And Bart, have you talked to anybody actually, full transparency, I asked you how Madison is doing with their, because it's a permit, right? It's not a license.
Correct, so just to clarify, current short-term rentals are required to get a license through the health department to operate as a place of boarding, I don't know what the technical term is. But there's just no staff capacity from the North Shore Health Department to follow or chase on these. So when we get complaints, we do forward them to the North Shore Health Department to reach out and say, hey, we understand that there's a complaint and you're doing this, you should get a license. So we have had one Airbnb within the village go through that process. We've requested that a second one go through it, and I believe they get 2 notices, they're close within their 60 days. So if they don't do that and we receive a complaint, they'd be subject to a fine from the North Shore Health Department based on state licensing of those. But once again, they don't have the capacity to do that. So there is a license requirement. We don't have a local permit requirement. Madison and Greendale do have a permit requirement. Village of Greendale might currently be suspended for what that's worth, but I don't know the technicality of that. In calling Madison, they identified that they made the permit process and they did this, but it's a lot of work to administer it and it's not changing anything. So it's a matter of, the issue arose and residents and or whoever complained and said you gotta get a handle on it. They chose to get a handle on it by getting a permit process undertaken. So people apply for the permit, staff has to administer the permit, staff has to enforce the permit, and still it's not showing much signs of changing the atmosphere of how they're operating because the state has preempted our ability to flat out prohibit them. So since they can operate, getting a permit really hasn't impacted the ability to do much else on them unless you would dedicate, a full-time staff person to being here on the weekends and knocking on doors and asking for registration lists and whatnot. So the one example, City of Madison requires a guest registration list so that at any time, if we received a complaint, we could knock on the door and say, you're required to show us your guest registration list, similar to a hotel, so we know who's staying here and whatnot, but that doesn't stop them from staying there, it just requires that the registration must be there. So the brief conversation I had with them months ago, prior to April was, they're doing something, but they don't necessarily recommend, or they don't necessarily think that it's changing anything. And I could follow up with them again, just like, because it's been a couple of months now since the last time I talked with them, and this is everything's a changing market, like that's what's said now, right? So maybe behavior has shifted in some respect, but they indicated that it's been a difficult thing to administer and enforce.
And then are there other legal levers that we can pull around?
So that's interesting, and I haven't had a chance to talk to Nathan about it because I didn't know what direction to go in it yet, but I believe it was in Greendale where Madison I think requires owner occupancy of the unit, so if you leased a duplex, you couldn't necessarily then short-term rental out your duplex. If you owned the house, you could do that. I don't know legally how you do that, and also I don't know how you enforce that either.
Right.
So who are you and what do you own?
Yeah, it's kind of.
So I haven't thought up on that. The other one was, I believe Greendale requires parking to be provided. So if you want to operate a short-term rental, you must prove to the village that you've got a place for someone to park. If you don't, I don't know that you can necessarily prohibit it, because once again, the state hasn't allowed you to prohibit it. So